In 1979, a number of things happen that are going to indicate the coming end, or at least some weaknesses in a seemingly ascendant form of communism. See, in the early 1970s, President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, made analogies between the Cold War in the 1970s and the Peloponnesian War. Again, the Soviets seemed to be in ascendancy, so they were Sparta, and we were Athens. And you remember who won the Peloponnesian War. It wasn't Athens. So there was a pessimism that was behind détente. But in 79, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. They did this because the Afghani government, which was friendly to Moscow, wasn't quite friendly enough, and they didn't want a foreign sympathizer government in the high mountains of Central Asia facing their borders. They invaded with a tank army in 1979. The Soviet war in Afghanistan was our opportunity to pay them back for the lovely things they did for us in Vietnam. Like they gave the Viet Cong anti-aircraft missiles, we gave the Afghan Mujahideen, the Holy Fighters of God, Stinger missiles that shot down Soviet planes and helicopters in droves. American CIA worked beside the Mujahideen, and in 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan, over 50,000 dead Russians in some way pay back the Russians for their part in killing over 50,000 dead Americans in Vietnam. It begins to have a demoralizing effect on Russia, and it is a drain on resources in exactly the same way that the Vietnam War was for us in the 1960s. But this is in the 1980s. In 1978, the American ally Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi of Iran is overthrown by the Islamic fundamentalist regime of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Imam Muslim scholar. Khomeini had been living in Paris as an exile. Now he's the leader of Iran. And the Iranians have this revolution in part because aside from Turkey, the only Arab, or the Iranians are Persians, they're not Arabs. The only Islamic country within the broader Middle East to ever really modernize past the late Middle Ages in terms of creating a more westernized secular society was Kemal Ataturk's Turkey from the 1920s up through the 1990s, and the Shah of Iran in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Iran had built an American-style middle class, a people that was Islamic, Iranian, but modern. And this scared the heck out of the more conservative religious leaders and people in the countryside, which led to the Iranian Revolution. The Shah was also brutal in his repressions, and President Carter forced him to hold back, or American aid would be cut. Well, when you are a dictator and you hold back, you might lose power, and that's what happens. So in 78, the Islamic Republic of Iran is declared. In 79, a group of Iranian students, including a future president of Iran, Mohammad Ahmadinejad, invade the American embassy, overcome the U.S. Marines, and take our embassy staff hostage. For 444 days, America is held hostage. Our news reports start every night at 6 o'clock. America held hostage, day 35, day 364, whatever. America seems impotent to do anything about these. President Carter decides on diplomacy. But after 6 months of being treated like a moron by the Iranians, Carter orders a military rescue of the hostages, which turns out to be a debacle. President Carter had systematically cut American defense spending for 3 years by that point, and the military forces that he sent into Iran ended up landing at a field that was supposed to be isolated called Desert One, to set up a fuel base for the final move into Tehran, the capital city where the hostages seemed to be. But this isolated strip turned out to be right next to a major highway, and a tour bus filled with hundreds of Iranian civilians ended up driving by and stopping, and they ended up getting captured. Well, what do? Do you let them go? Do you kill them all? So we're not going to do that. So we keep them prisoner for a while. But already our cover is blown. If they're going to come down the road, who else will come down the road? Finally, in our haste, as our helicopters begin to take off, there's a midair collision with a cargo plane. The explosion of the collision of the two can be seen for hundreds of miles in the dark. We end up evacuating. By the next morning, the Iranians and their television crews are crawling over the wreckage of American aircraft, and we look like putzes. We finally tried military action, even though we said we wouldn't, and we were incompetent, and we failed, and things got worse. President Carter, as a result of this, loses the 1980 election to a conservative Republican named Ronald Reagan. Reagan believes in rolling back the Soviet Union. He does not believe in just a maintenance of détente. He does not just believe in holding the line. He believes that the communists are weaker than anyone thinks, and he is going to push and challenge the Soviets. And he's joined by this with an ally, Pope John Paul II of the Roman Catholic Church, the first non-Italian pope in 500 years. He was born Karol Wojtyła, and he became Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow in southern Poland. Pope John Paul and President Reagan, along with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Britain and Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany, end up putting massive pressure on the Soviets. For example, in Poland, the communists' worst nightmare appears. A trade union of heavy industrial workers, ship workers, at the Gdansk shipyard, used to be the city of Danzig. This trade union is exactly the kind of people who communism is supposed to be for. They're led by Lech Walesa, the union leader and steel worker. How do communists put down a persistent trade union movement of industrial workers who are saying all the things that communists say, but they're talking also about freedom? In the end, the military ends up taking over Poland because they're afraid that the Russians are going to come in with tanks like they did in Czechoslovakia in '68 and Hungary in '56. But by suppressing the Solidarity trade union, the Polish government runs afoul of the Helsinki Accords. The Soviets have to somehow justify the military repressions of General Jaruzelski and the military regime, the communist military regime that now runs Poland. They have to justify it in terms of the Helsinki Accords when they're not supposed to have human rights violations. Meanwhile, the Pope is placing the Catholic Church squarely behind the solidarity movement, saying that the Catholic Church stands with the dignity of man, and that communism disfigures the dignity of man by turning man into a slave, and worse. Now, there were left-wing elements within the Catholic Church that were sympathetic to communism, liberation theologians in Central America, for example, but the main line of the Catholic Church was helpful in undermining Soviet power in the East. The USSR's economy had been militarized since the 20s, since the end of the NEP. Khrushchev tried changing this in the 50s with goulash communism. It didn't work. But now, by the 1980s, when the death of Brezhnev occurs, the Soviet economy is collapsing. It is shaking apart. It's like an engine in a vehicle that has been used and used and used and not properly oiled or maintained for years. It's ready to collapse. And at this point, President Reagan pushes them by saying that we in the United States will build a satellite and ground-based missile defense system, which the press dubs the Star Wars system, which his real name is the SDI system, the Strategic Defense Initiative. That we have the technology to set up an anti-missile shield that will destroy Soviet missiles as they go over the North Pole. Our Air Force can stop the bombers. Our Navy can stop their missile submarines. But with the Star Wars missile defense system, we can actually nullify the mutually assured destruction that we've all been living under. The Soviets go bug nuts. In 1987, Reagan meets with the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, at the Reykjavik in Iceland. And in Iceland, the Soviets agreed to a number of concessions that they refused to agree to for decades, if only Reagan will give up SDI. Reagan refuses. The Soviets are going to spend themselves into oblivion trying to keep up with an American technology that is still being developed, even now still being developed. The fear of American SDI causes the Russian economy to pancake. At this point, Gorbachev has some choices to make. Gorbachev had, when he took power, said that he is going to liberalize society. There's going to be glasnost, which is openness, and perestroika, a restructuring of the Soviet system, which everyone knew was moribund. What to do? We'll see that next.